Okay, thank you, thank you. To be honest, I have to say that this summer I spent a lot of time reading your book. This one.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Your post, you do videos and so on. And I had to say thank you for so much information. Okay.
Yeah, and I would like to thank the other 6 authors of the book. Yeah.
Okay. It works for you. Let me ask you some questions about the Agile too, in order to the Spanish community and the people in Spain can know about it. Okay.
Thank you. And I'm sorry I can't do this interview in Spanish. I studied Spanish, but it's not good enough. My daughter's fluent in Spanish. My sister's fluent in Spanish. My mother was fluent in Spanish and Portuguese.
Okay.
But mine is not good enough, so I apologize.
No problem. Thank you. You are one of the co-founders of the Agile 2, right?
Yes.
Okay. And could you tell us something about your background in the Agile or in the technical world?
Sure. Well, when the Agile movement started, I was already 20 years into my career. My career started in the early 1980s, and I started out in engineering. I was an electrical engineer and a nuclear engineer. And then I got into system engineering. And I was one of the people on the team that developed the VHDL language, which is a hardware description language, but it's also a concurrent data flow language. But anyway, in the 90s, when the internet started to flourish, I started a company with a colleague, and it grew really, really rapidly. I was CTO. We grew to about 200 people in total. And in 2000, Kent Beck's book had just come out, Extreme Programming Explained. Mm-hmm. And one of my software architects suggested to his project manager that they try it. And so they asked me, and I gave the okay. And it worked really well, I think, to their credit, because those were good people. And we embraced it fully. And my company became an extreme programming company. We built everything fixed price back then. So we really stood behind what we did, and we built big stuff. For McKesson Pharmaceuticals, their digital delivery platform for all their pharmacies, Capital One Bank, we built things for IBM and Federal Express. We built business to business things that really had to work. Mm-hmm. But anyway, my journey in the Agile, when the Agile Manifesto came out, I was very interested in those ideas because a lot of people think that before Agile, everything was waterfall. And that's absolutely not true. Mm-hmm. In my entire 20 years of career before 2000, I had been on one waterfall project. Everything else was highly Agile. I also worked at a company where I developed compilers. I helped develop several compilers, and I built the first hardware synthesis compiler for VHDL. But those teams were very Agile. We worked against a language feature backlog. There was very strong servant leadership, immense amount of collaboration. We had private offices, but we were mm-hmm. constantly talking to each other. And we ran complete automated regression tests every night. There was a lot of Agile going on, and that was in the 80s. So what really happened in the 90s, we kind of had a methodology craze. I think PMI played a role in that, and suddenly you started to see more and more waterfall. And so when the Agile Manifesto came out, I was very glad because I thought it was pushing us back to what used to work. It wasn't new to me and my colleagues. It was like refreshing. It was like, yes, this is what really works. We know from experience this is what works. and so I very much championed the ideas, but I felt that the Agile community was kind of ignoring some important things like security and reliability and also architecture. It was a little bit too extreme. And so I kept an eye on it. I ended up writing a book called High Assurance Design, which doesn't sound Agile, but it was. It was back then the reliability and security community were very much about top-down process. But my book was about what lessons I learned as CTO at my company, about patterns, and basically, it was my feeling that the developers needed to have the knowledge to build high assurance systems. It wasn't about controlling them, it was about empowering them. And that's what that book was about. And so I kept an eye on it. And there were people in the Agile community who I think did have a mature view, like Scott Ambler and Joanna Rothman and Dinah Larson and many others. And I kept in touch with them over the years. I still talk to them. And so, when DevOps arose, DevOps was kind of a rekindling of the technical part, which had kind of left the Agile space, strangely. So anyway, to catch up to today, when I've felt, and my colleagues have felt for a long time, that the Agile ideas were extremely powerful and extremely important, but that things had gone awry a little bit, and there were things that were too extreme and not nuanced enough and too generalized. And it was, there were kind of like a lot of shallow ideas, like you hear about org culture, but no one can tell you what that is. Well, actually, there are people who study org culture, and there have been for a long time, and they have very clear ideas about what it is. But somehow the Agile community has not connected with that. So my colleagues and I have, people like Jess Humble and Nicole Forsgren have as well. If you read their book Accelerate, they talk about the Western culture model. So when the pandemic started, we saw it as an opportunity, and because we needed a pivot. And we needed a pivot that didn't throw Agile out, but that strengthened Agile, because Agile's really important. I see a lot of IT executives are wondering, well, we're having trouble with Agile, but we know we need DevOps. You know what? Forget Agile. Let's just do DevOps. That won't work, because DevOps doesn't have answers for how to deal with lots of teams and so on. But Agile really doesn't either. It claims to, but it really doesn't. And then you have these frameworks that claim to also, but they kind of are process heavy. But the real issue is human behavior and leadership. So they kind of miss, it's not that they're bad, but they're kind of missing the important things. So anyway, we put a team together and we created a chart of the kinds of skills we wanted for that team. And we wanted a diverse team. We didn't want it to be culturally homogeneous. We wanted a global team. We have people in Vietnam and Australia and India, and we some of the expertise we wanted was product design, Agile product design, human resources, Agile human resources like people ops and some of the newer ideas, Agile program management, DevOps, of course. So we had a data science. The Agile community basically forgot about data somehow. And we're paying the price for that today. Today, people have data lakes, so they can't make use of. So we created this team, and then the first thing we did was we conducted a retrospective of what was working and what wasn't working. And because it was a global team, we couldn't all meet. There's no way. In fact, we couldn't even meet online because there were people on the other side of the world. It'd be, noon for us is midnight for them. So we had to have a lot of small meetings, and we had to do most things asynchronously. And we created Google Docs we created issue-centric Google Docs. So every issue that came up, we created a Google Doc, and that's where our discussion lived. And we also created a lot of email threads that got really deep. We'd have like 15 colors of people responding in these email threads. And so once we finished our retrospective, we had a list of what we called problems and insights. And to be considered a valid problem and insight, at least 2 people had to have mentioned it. And then from those problems and insights, we had a subsequent discussions using the same tools, Slack, Google Docs, email, and a very large number of very small group, mostly one-on-one Zoom sessions. And we merged our ideas, and we ended up distilling out what ended up being 43 principles. And the important thing about these principles, they're not rules. They're reminders. They're just reminders, like, consider this. And also for each principle, we give all the problems and insights that led to the principle. So you can see what the principle actually means. You can see its intent. And then you can judge for yourself if it's helpful. So these principles are not rules. They're reminders of things to consider. And then finally, we got 100% consensus on the principles. To make the bar to be a principle, we had about 100 of them, and we cut a lot out that we didn't have consensus on. To reach the bar of being considered a final principle, all 15 people had to agree with it. And then after that, we then came up with values. That was the last step. So everything was a bottom-up distillation, from problems to principles to values. And then we published it, and then 7 of us very speedily wrote a book in order to explain it, because the website has all the stuff, but it's a lot of detail. The book is readable. The book is designed, the book's not like a textbook. It's designed to be like a readable explanation with examples and so on.
It's a very good book. Congratulations.
Oh, thank you.
Do you think the Agile needs to be fixed in order to save it today?
Yes and no. So the Agile community has kind of divided. Again, it divided with DevOps. Today the DevOps community is separate from the Agile community, which is kind of strange, because the early authors about DevOps very strongly identified as Agilists. Jez Humble wrote the seminal book about DevOps, his continuous delivery book. Gene Kim's Phoenix project came out 3 years later. And, Jez Humble had been doing consulting for lots of companies. So he kind of connected the dots and wrote a book about it. He had seen what was going on at lots of different places. He uses the word Agile. I think I counted more than 40 times in that book. He saw himself as an Agilist. He went to Agile conferences and talked about it. And his events were very well attended, but somehow the DevOps and CI/CD stuff did not really permeate the Agile community at large. The Agile coaches kind of weren't that interested in that because it was technical, and the Agile community had somehow, a large part of the Agile community had lost interest in the technical side of things. So today, the reality today is someone who knows about DevOps generally doesn't know much about Agile, and vice versa. Usually someone who's an Agilist doesn't know much about DevOps. Of course, there are many exceptions. I know many Agile coaches who are very much into the technical side, but they're a minority. And this is not to criticize anyone, but it's a wake-up call. We need to retrospect on that, and we need to realize, Agile coaches who are not technical don't need to become engineers, but they need to learn about it, just like they need to learn about product design and data. They need to learn about the technical side too. They don't have to become so good they could do it themselves, but they have to become versed in it. They have to get an understanding of the moving parts. Just like, important part of Agile too is business people need to get an understanding of how delivery happens, because otherwise they can't have good conversations about trade-offs. Today the technology platform is how most large organizations do business. And if you don't understand how it works, you can't trade off future value versus time to market investments. So, everyone needs to have a working understanding of the whole value stream. You can't just silo yourself. Everyone has to, you don't have to be an expert in everything. You need to be an expert in your area, but everyone needs to have a working understanding of the whole flow.
I was reading one of your posts in LinkedIn. Concretely, do you remember that about the old versus the new Agile, where you say that some members of the Agile community are in the past, okay? And they still believe in the old Agile myths and dogma, okay?
That's where I was leading, and thanks for reminding me, because I didn't close the loop on that. So a lot of people if you look at what people have been writing in the last 10 years versus the first 10 years, it's quite different. If, one of my favorite books is by David Marquette, Turn the Ship Around. And, he was a submarine captain, and he talks about leadership in that book and how his style of leadership was empowering. And instead of trying to control everybody, he gave them objectives and let them figure out how to do it. And he was not hands off. To him, it was not just about just empower the team and stand back. It wasn't like that at all. He watched very closely and he made decisions, but he wanted people to solve the problems themselves, and he was supportive. And he also trained them to think out loud. In the military, you're trained to think to yourself and then just say what your decision is or say what your thought is. He reversed that. He trained his crew to think out loud, to explain their reasoning, so that it could be dialectic, it could be a discussion. And so he created a safe, open environment in his crew, and that's leadership. Early Agile writing was very suspicious of leadership, and there are many books that say this. There's a book by Mark Schwartz, A Seat at the Table, where he even says, Agile community is suspicious of leaders. They don't like managers and so on. Jess Humble has said that. And it's very clear, the early Agile writing. If you look at the Agile Manifesto, it talks about self-organization and talks about trust the team, but it doesn't say anything about leadership. It's almost like there's no role for explicit authority of any kind. And, not all leaders have explicit authority. There are many kinds of leadership. Socrates was a leader. He led by asking questions. Gandhi was a leader. He led by demonstrating action, by walking the talk. Every individual who takes their initiative is a leader. But positional authority also is really important in organizations. You can't really get things done quickly without positional authority. And, you need the support of the people at the top, and, they need to be behind a transformation, and, they need to drive it, but they need to do it in an open way. And, they need to create the right environment. They need to create the right culture. And, to answer your question about the Agile community dividing, there are segments of the Agile community that cling to the old narratives, that are suspicious of leadership and, feel that you trust the team and kind of in an extreme way. And then there are a lot of new writers who have a more nuanced view. Trust the team is very good. That's a positive thing, but it's not an absolute. You don't take a bunch of new programmers from college and say, here, build this microservice, and if you fail, that's just a learning experience. Well, you know what? If a bank deploys a microservice that calculates an incorrect bank balance, the regulators come in and say, what the heck's going on? You can't fail in that. So you need a more nuanced view of trust and of failure. Failure needs to be in a safe context. It needs to be early in the stream. It needs to be in a test setting, or with very limited users, or, failure needs to be thoughtful. Right now, SpaceX is testing rockets, and they don't just say, oh, we'll fail, whatever, send people up and have people die. They have the failure occur during early testing. That's when the failure happens, and that's just using good judgment. So a lot of the Agile ideas are really important and powerful, but they're more nuanced, and if you look at what's been written in the last 10 years, it's a lot more mature. Books by Klaus Leopold, Rethinking Agile, and, plus a lot of DevOps books. I mentioned Accelerate. There's a whole chapter on leadership in there, a really good chapter. And, I think the focus on org culture, and what people have been writing in the last 10 years, there's a lot of really good, mature stuff. And the community has kind of split into the people who cling to the original ideas versus the people who've moved forward and have elaborated and developed a more mature view of agility. And that's what Agile 2 tries to capture. It tries to capture that more mature view.
Mhm. Okay. We have a lot. If I reading your post in LinkedIn, you wrote in your post something like the everything should be self-organized and the team should be fully autonomous as a myth in the Agile today. And we have a lot of problem today with the self-organized. What do you think about this? What do you think, and why is a myth today? What is the problem today with the self-organized or self-management or so on? Okay.
Sure. Well, if you look at organizations that really make this work, like companies like Google and Netflix and Amazon and so on, they don't actually have self-organizing teams. That they say they do, but if you look at what they really do, they don't. What they have is mostly self-organizing teams. And they all have specialized groups that go around and help teams. And they've all created a lot of self-service infrastructure that enable the teams to do a lot of things themselves safely and well, and in a way that's aligned with how the organization wants to do it.
Yeah.
So that's different from just saying, oh, a self-organizing autonomous team. A lot of organizations hear that and they think, oh, I'll just let every team decide what it wants to do and let them figure it out. That's not what really works. What really works is if you have a proactive, empowering leader, which doesn't have to be one individual. It can be multiple individuals working together. But someone has to architect the ecosystem. Someone has to look at the teams and what they're trying to do and figure out, what level of experience do they have and what kinds of leadership do those teams need, not, within the team and also across the teams. And they need to take steps to make sure those teams have the right kinds of leadership. And it can be by appointing people in a traditional way, or it can be in a non-traditional way. It can be, maybe challenge a team and watch to see who emerges. But you have to be careful there because very often a leader who emerges is not the right one. It can be someone who is very vocal, for example. And there may be thoughtful, quiet people on the team never get a word in. So emergent leadership is not automatically a positive thing. It can be very toxic. There's a famous a famous article by Jo Freeman from the women's movement where she talks about that, how it's really a myth that you have a leaderless organization, because what happens is leaders emerge. And power, that's leader member exchange theory, which is a central descriptive theory in organization culture. What tends to happen in groups is an inner circle evolves, usually controlled by one individual, and they aggregate. And this even happens with chimpanzees. Yeah. The same phenomenon happens with chimpanzees as humans. And what happens is you end up with a person with an inner circle, and to get into the inner circle, you have to show them that you're loyal to the inner circle. And then so there's like an in group and an out group, kind of like in high school, and that's what tends to happen very frequently in flat organizations. You end up with hidden power networks. It's not a fair situation at all. If you go back a century, Max Weber wrote about the problem of flat organizations using terminology of the day, and saw explicit organization structure as a remedy for the unfairness of organizations that didn't have structure. And now we've flipped around because there's no silver bullet to this. If you add structure, there are problems too. Because it really comes down to the individuals. It's not structure and hierarchy are not the problem. The problem is how people behave. It's the way you need people who behave as good leaders. They're inquisitive. They don't punish. They take responsibility. They're decisive, but they also let everybody. They let they empower people too to solve problems their own way. There are paradigms for this too. If you go back to the Prussian army in the early 1800s, they had a model called mission command, which was basically the idea that an effective senior leader should, number one, train all the field units, make sure they have sufficient training so that they can make their own decisions and make good decisions, and then empower them, because in the field you often have communication gets cut off and they have to make their own decisions. So it's all about, this was the Prussian army in the 1800s. It was all about empowering people in the field to make their own choices. But it required that they be fully trained ahead of time so that they could make good decisions.
Okay, thank you. Let me another one. What do you think about the Agile coaches don't need to take an interest in the technical aspects?
So
it's a real problem today.
Yeah, I teach a course called DevOps. I teach a couple of DevOps courses. I teach for O'Reilly Online Learning, and I teach for another company. I also develop my own curriculum, which I feel is like a lot better than everything that's out there. But the reason I developed is not to do training. I developed to upskill Agile coaches, because I feel that they need to understand the technical stuff. And the people who've gone through that course, I just had 2 people complete it recently. It took them a year. I teach them just enough programming so they can do the assignments, so that they actually experience the different things that teams do. And it's a multi-team simulation. So you actually experience, like, when you have multiple components and integration issues and things like that, and deployments in the cloud, and why can be so difficult if you're doing your testing in the cloud. So I actually help them experience the real issues. And the people who've been through that course tell me that it's completely changed their job, that it's empowered them hugely. People look at them differently. They're now invited to meetings they weren't invited to before. They're taken more seriously, and they can talk to teams and understand everything that's going on. So it's like one Agile coach told me that it was like she'd been seeing the world in black and white, and now for the first time she saw it in color. So it's really important. It's really important, because an Agile coach is a leader.
Yes.
An Agile coach is coaching is a form of leadership. It's not someone who has positional authority, but leadership is influence. There are many different kinds of leadership. An Agile coach influences. They should be inquisitive, Socratic. There should be some mentorship going on. Generally, usually, someone who's a good coach also is a mentor to some degree, and vice versa, and a teacher. You're not just one thing. Usually people who are effective use multiple forms of leadership. And, it's really important to know the vocabulary and to understand the work of the team.
Yes.
And understand the business of the organization, and to know what's going on, that understand the whole flow. Everybody who has a role in that flow should understand the whole flow enough to be able to have productive conversations about it.
But the reality we see now, I'm working with a lot of companies, and I see a lot of Agile coach and even Scrum Masters, that they don't understand the vocabulary of the teams. They don't have any knowledge about technical skills or vocabulary. Okay.
Well, they can fix that. They don't have to become experts. They don't have to become engineers. They need to start somewhere. They need to start reading some books about it, and they need to, a really good thing for a Scrum Master or an Agile coach to do is to partner with someone who's really technical, a technical lead or an architect, someone who knows the technical side, and kind of be a little team, because, an Agile coach or Scrum Master, they do know stuff. They know their stuff, but it's incomplete, and what the technical person knows is incomplete. If you put them together, that's a very powerful team, and they can mentor each other and help each other. I've done that. I've partnered with Agile coaches, and it worked fantastically well. Because now you have a person who you can discuss things with, who you can ask questions, and together you can talk through issues and synthesize the Agile and technical issues into a single approach that you can then propose to the team and say, what do you think about this?
Yes.
A good leader does propose ideas, but they do it in a way so that people know they can push back. It's a good leader says, what about this? What if we did this? And creates, and has an attitude where people can see that they can say, no, that won't work. And then listens. And, well, really, why won't that work? Oh, okay, I get it. Well, what do you think we should do? That's thought leadership, is, proposing ideas and listening. And helping the best idea win, facilitating that. Facilitating is not just good facilitating does include suggesting your own ideas. It's how you do it. It's how you do it.
Okay. Thank you. Let me last question. What is the difference between Agile 2 and the other within frameworks like Agile or the Heart of Agile or so on?
Well, so like Modern Agile and Heart of Agile are, I don't really see them as frameworks. I see them as models.
Yes.
They're kind of like the Agile Manifesto, which was an abstract model, kind of. It was, but one problem with the Agile Manifesto, I think Agile 2 doesn't try to replace Agile. It tries to strengthen Agile and kind of correct it a little bit and shore it up. The Agile Manifesto was a brilliant document. It still is. It's got problems. There's one of the principles I actually disagree with pretty strongly because it's stated as an absolute. But another problem with it is it doesn't explain itself. So people have misinterpreted it. They've treated it as an absolute, like extremes, like, individuals and interactions over processes and tools. Well, processes and tools can be really important too. You know what? If your tool's not working today and you need to deploy, that day it becomes the most important thing of all. So it's a matter of balance. It's a matter of there's judgment involved in prioritizing these things. And, I think the Agile Manifesto, its main failing, and I'm not saying it failed, I think it's an important document, but its main gap is that it doesn't explain itself. There's no narrative accompanying it. You have to read 1,000 different authors and they all say different things, So, I think, Heart of Agile and Modern Agile and so on, I think they've tried to simplify something that really can't be simplified. This is complex stuff. Leadership is a complex issue. Cognitive focus is a complex issue. So people have been writing about leadership for thousands of years. So you're not going to have a bumper sticker maxim that tells you everything you know about how to lead, what kind of, how leadership should work. You can't simplify it. You can't simplify it. Those things are inspiring documents. They're not bad. I applaud them. But then they have a role, they have a place to inspire people. But it's a starting point. People need to read, and not just read Agile 2. They need to study leadership theory. There's actually a textbook by Northhouse on leadership, and it's very current. I think it's the 8th edition now or something. And there's new research being done on it all the time, and there's a rich field of organization culture. There's my company, we've partnered with this company called Human Synergistics, and they developed one of the most robust culture models 50 years ago, by the way, that's been used with 30,000 organizations. And so there's a lot of knowledge and information about how you can assess organizations' culture, and how you can look at that through an agility lens. And people need to read and learn. People need to learn about it. You can just writing down a few ideas and say, oh, that's Agile, that's all we need. That doesn't work. This is a learning journey. It's a lifelong learning journey for all of us. And things like Modern Agile or Agile Manifesto and even Agile 2, they're only starting points, or they're posts along the way. We've all started learning when we were born. They're things along the way to consider, but then we don't stop there. We keep going.
Okay, thank you. To conclude, what is the future of the Agile 2? What are the next steps in the Agile 2?
Yeah. So there are a couple things on that. I don't see there being an Agile 3 and 4 and 5 and so on. We created Agile 2. We debated the name a lot, and we decided to call it Agile 2. So the Agile community knew we were talking about Agile and not something else. And we called it 2 to make the Agile community realize that we think a pivot is needed. But it's not new. As I mentioned, there have been books, written in the last 10 years that largely say what Agile 2 says. We've just pulled it together and integrated it, and put a common narrative that cuts across all these more recent ideas. So people have been doing it. The people who make this stuff work have been doing things that Agile 2 says. If you go through Agile 2, someone who's highly experienced will probably nod their head at most things. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's right. So it's not really new. It's kind of another stake in the ground about we're trying to readjust the standard narrative for what Agile is, because there's a lot of bad Agile. There's part of the community has clung to the old Agile ideas, which weren't bad. They were just too simple. They're too simple-minded or too extreme. And so we need the standard narrative to be more sophisticated and more realistic, and more open and more inclusive of other sets of ideas like leadership theory and cognitive theory and so on. We should read books like by Daniel Kahneman about how people think, and you can't just learn Agile. So where Agile 2 is going, we're trying to just reinforce the more recent ideas, and we might come out with some slight adjustments or something, but we don't want it to be treated like the Scrum Guide is treated. Every time the Scrum Guide gets updated, people all parse every word and say, oh, now it says this, but it used to say that. Oh, we don't view it that way. We view it as just a set of ideas for people to consider. None of them are absolutes. It's not dogmatic. It's explicitly open. We say that. And if we make some adjustment in some way, it's just an offering. It's an offering of additional ideas or tweaks to those ideas, but they're just ideas. They're not rules.
Okay, Cliff. Thank you. So, thank you for the interview. It's so interesting. I think that we need new ideas in the Agile world, because the ideas today are from 20 years ago and so on. And I think that the ideas like the Agile 2 are so important in the order to a new blood in the Agile community, in the order to don't speak about the ideas or the old ideas from 20 years ago. Thank you so much for this time. Thank you. If you need something, please send me an email or a LinkedIn or so on. Okay?
I will. Thank you, Javier. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I hope talk with you in the future. Okay?
Thank you. I hope we talk again.
Thank you, Cliff. Thank
Bye.
you. Bye.